The whistle has blown. We're now into extra time. I am joined by SI columnist Emma Baccellieri. We've worked together before.
We have.
We have. When I was working at SI, I was the producer of Sports Illustrated Weekly briefly, and we did some stories, Relievers Who Rumble, relievers getting into fights, Dodger Dogs, which is, of course, about Dodger Dogs, and Mic'd Up, which is when a few years ago they started miking up players in the middle of the games and having fun with them. And doing that with you, I think is what turned me on to the fact that you might be into some of the weirder baseball things.
Yes, that is my favorite part of baseball, maybe even my favorite part of sports. Even though I've moved away from baseball coverage a little in the last few years, that has always been my bread and butter, like weird stuff, I think, put broadly. And so this was perfect, yeah. Yeah,
so that kind of brings me into my first question, which is like, did you know about George Brunet? Because, I mean, I always the way I find my stories very often is I'll just see a snippet of something, a baseball card, a program or something, but I don't remember how I learned about George Brunet. And so it's been in my backlogs of stories I wanted to tell for a long time. But did you know about him at all?
I did not. And that was actually going to be one of my questions to you is how did you find this? Because I always love people's journeys of discovery to something like this. But no, I mean, when you said the name and invited me on this, I then, of course, looked him up and I was trying to figure out, like, does this sound familiar to me or not? I was thinking Ball 4 would have been where I would have heard the name. That's, I think, the only context I would have come across it. But I was trying to figure out, like, had I actually heard this name? Is this something that was in the back of my mind that's now being brought up? Or am I just telling myself that? But no, I certainly did not know about the breadth of the story and how much of a journey it was. And if that name was familiar to me at all, it was only from Ball 4.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have some more specific questions about Ball 4 later because it's a fascinating book and it's a fascinating, like, cultural object at this point. But, like, I want to say the way I've learned about George Brunet is that there's, it used to be Twitter. There was a Twitter account that I followed called Sports Papers, and I believe they still are active on other socials and less so on Twitter itself. But they just post constantly these little, programs, team photos, all these things. And they had a picture of him in one of the jerseys when he was playing in Mexico. And I want to say it was the Tomateros, which I think translates roughly to, like, tomato farmers. And so he was, and I was, fascinated, like captivated. And I'm a big rabbit hole guy. I dive down the rabbit hole. And obviously, when you start digging with George Brunet, even for a second, you go, oh. And it keeps getting weirder. So now we can start getting into, like, some more interesting questions. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that the longest serving baseball player would have been a position player. Like, I'm surprised that's a pitcher because pitchers, they only need one thing in their arm to go wrong, and that's years, a career. They can get really worn down really fast, even though they only play every 5-6 games. Like, are you surprised that, the longest serving player, 33 seasons, George Brunet, was a pitcher and he never missed a game from injury?
I mean, the last part of that sentence is the truly insane part to me, the fact that he never missed anything from injury. I actually do think, though, I can see a case for the longest tenured guy being a pitcher just because I think now it's obviously a little different with the existence of the universal DH. That changes the calculus. But when you're talking historically, I think it has been much easier to hide your age as a pitcher, or like you are forced to find ways to compensate for your age, to compensate for your body breaking down in ways as a pitcher that it's much harder to do as a position player, that, like, there's only so much you can do to make up for a lack of speed anywhere in the field. There's only so much you can do as your body is breaking down as, like, a catcher. Like, even if you're talking about positions that are outside of the middle, even if you're talking about, like, a first baseman, there's still just only so much you can do to make up for the lack of raw physical tools as you get older. And as a pitcher, you have tools at your disposal in terms of craftiness, in terms of varying your arsenal. I'm kind of surprised that if you were going to tell me that this was a pitcher, I would have believed it was a knuckleballer, like someone who was just operating. Yeah, exactly. Like someone just operating on craft alone, especially like as I'm making up this hypothetical potential other longest tenured guy in my mind. I would have thought the ideal would have been someone who pitched for quite a while, had to make an adjustment, discovered a knuckleball in his like mid 30s, and then was able to ride that out. That's who I would have picked, someone like that. But yeah, I think it actually doesn't surprise me that it's a pitcher. It does surprise me that it was this particular pitcher. But I think I can see a case for just the ways that you have to adapt and adjust and constantly tinker as a pitcher. The fact that even though it is so hard on your body, every 5 days is different from every day. I think I would have believed that it was a pitcher, just not quite a pitcher in this specific model.
Sure, and it seems like he had a kind of a pitching renaissance when he went to Mexico. Like when he started, Ted Williams said, like, if he can keep his fastball down, he'll have a long career. He never kept his fastball down in the majors and minors in the United States, and that was basically the reason he never really did anything. But when he went to Mexico, and when I was talking to Francisco Padilla from the Mexican Baseball Hall of Fame, the thing that came up a lot was his control and his curveball. He said it was poison to hitters, which I thought was a beautiful way to describe it. But like, it's the classic, like, can an old dog learn new tricks? It does seem like something did change with Brunet, and he did like actually learn how to, be a more well-rounded pitcher when he went to Mexico. And I find that fascinating because you don't expect people to kind of like learn in situ. You kind of think at a certain point, well, he's 38. I don't think he's going to get better.
It's especially fascinating to me reading these stories from mid-century, from basically, honestly, anytime before like 2005, that like now we think of so many ways to teach a guy a new pitch, to adjust his grip, to adjust his biomechanics, that, even someone in his mid-30s, send him to Driveline for the winter and watch him come back as a new guy. It obviously is a lot more complicated than that, but it seems like in this modern frame of thinking, the only way that can happen is this very statistically, biomechanically optimized process of identifying exactly what is wrong and exactly what you have to do to fix it. And that the only ways that happens are through looking at enormous amounts of data and pinpointing these very small, precise tweaks. And obviously, like, pitchers have been learning new pitches or adjusting their grip to do something different with their pitches for a really long time before we had any kind of pitch tracking. Like, it's possible to do without that. But it is always fascinating to me when you read these stories about this happening before you had the data framework, the language even to describe exactly what was happening. And frankly, you didn't have people asking the same questions, so you weren't even getting the kind of answers that you could put in the same conversation as you have now. And yeah, I just really love it because, like, yeah, obviously it is possible to come across someone new who suggests something small. Maybe it's something that wasn't even the product of a new teammate or a new manager or a new pitching coach. Maybe it was just something in that environment that made you think, I want to try something slightly different. Maybe you did it once by accident and then you stick with it and you realize, oh, this was the change I should have been making all along. Maybe it's not even a conscious change. Maybe with age, as you're adjusting to your body functioning differently, you do something slightly different in your mechanics without even realizing it, and it turns out that's what you should have been doing all along. But yeah, I love these stories of, an old pitcher learning something new, an old player discovering something when he should be out, when you don't have any of the framework to kind of analyze it the way that we would now.
Yeah, so you were talking about like the pitchers, modern pitchers using all kinds of analytics and data, and they're iPad kids. They're out there, watching what they're doing as it's happening. But this is a question that I was thinking as I was going through. Do you think it would be more likely that George Brunet would have washed out earlier if he was playing in the modern MLB, or do you think they would have been able to actually fix him earlier? So, like, would they have given him fewer chances, or would they have just actually gotten the best out of him right away?
That's a really good question, because I feel like this is so intertwined with both how he was actually performing as a pitcher and who he was as a person that I think that alcohol alone probably would have changed a lot of things in 2026. But then, of course, you have the question of like, if he were in this environment, he probably wouldn't be drinking and going out quite as much, just because that's not how baseball is set up. That's not how professional sports are set up to function anymore, for better or for worse. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a point to be made that like, if you have better raw stuff, if you have clear underlying talent, which I think he probably did, that would have been spotted earlier, that would have been able to be finessed with specific moves to maximize his strengths earlier. At the same time, I think immediately, even then, so much of the problem that they were clear, it's like he's not willing to do what he has to do to be a consistent professional pitcher who's getting results because of how he's living his life. Like that was a problem then, and it would be more of a problem now. And I think you're less likely to see kind of infinite chances handed out now. Man, that's a really good question, and I can kind of see that going either way.
Yeah, I really sat down and tried to think like, do I think could he have his career now, or is it just impossible to do it? I think it's just impossible. I think everything has changed. Like all of the parts of his career have just completely changed. But I think it's time we talk about the worst inning ever pitched. So it was only partially Brunet's fault. And of course, this is the one where he walked in, bases loaded, walked 5 runs in, and he hit a guy. So that's 6 runs total. I was briefly considering having kind of more of a thread through the podcast about his luck, George Brunet's luck, because I think it went both ways. It vacillated widely, because sometimes you're like, wow, what a lucky, fortuitous circumstance that led to this kind of wild roller coaster career. And other times you're like, oh, but he could have had a much more normal career if, a couple things had gone better. Do you when a pitcher has an inning like that, which is just literally historically bad, how much of that is on Brunet? How much of that is on the A's for just putting him in an awful spot? And how much of that is just, like, straight up bad luck?
I actually think when it's this bad, it is actually easier to draw the line of, like, it's one thing to let a guy issue 1, 2, 3 bases loaded walks. Once you're past that, I think you are, like, clearly in what is the manager doing, what's going on, even if the bullpen is totally empty and exhausted, like, throw a position player in. It can't get worse. Like, but you are clearly like inflicting some kind of severe trauma on this poor guy. You just need to get him out of there. I think quite a bit goes to the manager, but yeah, you're right. It's a really fascinating thing. I think also going back to not to view everything through the lens of how this would work today. You just don't get to see guys work through mistakes today that much, even in meaningless September games, even in the minors. Obviously you have like a different framework for what you're looking for, but it is so rare to get to watch someone work through a disaster like that. You only get so much space, and it's even when the outcome of the game is already a foregone conclusion, like you just don't get to see a guy trying to find it at that point, because the sport's just not set up for that at any level. And that's when listening to you talk about it in the original episode, I was thinking like, man, I would really love to see the pitch charts on this if they had existed today, of just like, was this a case where he was like wildly outside the zone, missing crazily, or was this like swinging back and forth, kind of getting in it, then getting out of it? And did this feel basically just like an insane unraveling where it was beyond the pale? Or frankly, I do think for him to be left in as long as he was, were these kind of more competitive at-bats that just consistently didn't go his way, and it kept thinking like, this has to turn around, the next one will be better, he'll end the inning. I kind of lean towards it having to be that kind of situation, which I think is a lot harder to go through, and also is a lot more interesting, just as like a tragic hero's journey of ups and downs, and thinking that something can happen here and then it can't, of, like you said, ton of really statistically unlikely, incredibly bad luck aligning with someone who has just enough talent to make you think this can work until the moment it doesn't and doesn't and doesn't.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. Like, we don't have his pitch charts. Like, and they're also, I mean, obviously there wasn't auto umping, so you couldn't tap your helmet or tap your hat in this case and hope you get maybe an extra strike in there that could have, ended the inning much sooner.
Yeah.
But like, it bothers me that this was his third game after he had been called up, and they did just absolutely put him in an awful inning because the pitcher that they removed had already walked in 3 runs. And so it's I think they essentially were putting in a position player. I think in their minds that's what they were. So they were letting him fail in order to see what they had, if anything. And this is, I think, a little bit like relatively far into his A's career before he was moved again and again and again to all of those teams that I mentioned earlier. So there is a second hero to this podcast, second story that I could tell later, and maybe I will. Bo Belinsky. Fascinating man. He's actually the more famous baseball weirdo of the two, like of George Brunet and Bo Belinsky. You're more likely to have heard of Bo Belinsky, probably. But he pitched a no-no in 1962, and he immediately quoted Shakespeare. And in a non sequitur, I might add, like it didn't make sense why he was doing that, and it wasn't an exact quote. So I think it's very fun that that's what he decided to say. But he punched a baseball writer. He washed out of the league. He dated actresses, singers, movie stars, and Playboy models. Famously, he married and then divorced a Playboy model. Which of those two careers, George Brunet's career, where he had the long career, was never really a star in the United States, goes to Mexico and becomes a beloved hero, or Bo Belinsky, who absolutely killed it for like 2-3 seasons, was like, in Cy Young Award debates and was dated all kinds of models and stuff, but then kind of completely washed out and ended up being like a kind of weirdo, like a pariah in some ways. Which of those two careers would you want?
Ooh. I think Belinsky certainly has the higher upside, but I'm going with Brunet. I think I really have always been a sucker for the kind of like long, mysterious journey of remaking yourself somewhere else. And I think especially because, I'm sorry, I feel like I keep going back to this of like, this is impossible now, but I really do appreciate that. Like, yes, certainly you have guys who will go to Japan for a season, reinvent themselves, figure it out, and come back, or guys who have gone over there and have finish out their careers there. Like, that certainly is possible. But this kind of mysterious arc to it of like, he's doing something there, he's found himself, he seems to be happy with it, and there's this kind of air of mystery of like, is he still there? How long is he actually going to pitch? When did he retire? The fact that all of that is so shrouded in this kind of very folkloric mythology of trying to figure out what he's done feels so impossible and so completely distant from what he did in the States, both, geographically and also in terms of his performance, that it becomes this kind of mysterious unknown quantity. I really love that. And I like the idea of like finding yourself at peace doing it as well as you can in a completely different environment, and realizing that a form of success can take a different form than you might have thought it had to. I'm a sucker for that. I'm going George Brunet.
Yeah, and I think I love that you brought up like the kind of mysterious angle of like, we weren't sure how long he pitched. So when I was doing the research for the podcast, there were so many articles, so many things that said he had pitched 37 seasons, or he had pitched till 1989 when he was 54. Remember, he died at 56, which means he was pitching up to the end. But when I actually, did some digging into it, like we could like saber all the baseball reference did not have any stats past 1980, or 1985 rather, and so when he was 50, and I asked Francisco Padilla, and he said that he was pitching. Trust me, he was pitching. He just stopped pitching at a professional level. He did a lot of amateur stuff, but he did a lot of youth things. So he was pitching, but at a youth level, and he was teaching and coaching. And I think that is really I think that's almost better, because if his last season, the 85 season, I think he pitched 2 games for the Tigers. He was mostly a pitching coach, kind of like a player coach, and they just had him take them out a few times. But I think he really did let the wheels fall off. He played until it was nothing left.
I really love that. I love a true classic lifer who, there's also an element of tragedy in that in an ideal world, certainly you would want people to be able to find full enough lives outside baseball that it doesn't have to be at the ballpark every day at whatever level you can until, like you said, the wheels fall off. But also I just love that of someone who, like you framed in the podcast in the original episode, loved this so much it gave him a new lease on life and a new perspective on what he could do as a person from the time he was very young. The idea of just taking that all the way through until you literally cannot anymore, no matter where you are, no matter how big the ballpark is, no matter what kind of team it is. Yeah, I'm also a sucker for that.
So I think you mentioned Ball 4 earlier at the top of this. I think we should talk a little bit more about Ball 4. Ball 4 was mostly famous for exposing 2 things, which is the womanizing that was happening all over across Major League Baseball, but also the drug use. Uppers, greenies, benzies. Those were if you ever want to have just a rundown of the list of drugs, I suggest you listen to Doc Ellis, his interview, the LSD no. He'll let you know. But he was but so there was all that going on in the locker rooms, and obviously in his locker room, because that's where he was. And yet, the managers were mad at him for drinking and eating too much. And I guess getting into fights, although I couldn't find any accounts, direct accounts of him actually fighting people. Everybody brings up the fact that he would get into fights and play cards and stuff. Could not find an article or anything saying that he punched a teammate or anything. But why do you think the managers cared more that he was drinking and partying essentially, instead of taking uppers and womanizing in a horrible way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like it's one of those things where certain guys can just get away with certain things depending on both who you are as a player and who you are as a person. And as you were saying that about the fighting, I can see it being one of those things where maybe he's not actually getting into fights, but the fact that he is constantly annoying people perhaps and making them think he is on the edge of a fight is actually more damning for him than if he had just hauled off and punched a guy one time. So being more
super belligerent.
Yes, exactly. That can make you a worse teammate, I think, in some ways, or a more annoying teammate to be around on a day-to-day basis in a sport where that's as important as baseball, where you are spending so much time with all of these guys. There's no opportunity for escape. It can actually, I think, be worse to be around someone who just really is always rubbing you the wrong way than to be around someone who maybe lost his temper once or twice and you could kind of brush it under the rug. But yeah, it is weird when you put it in context of that was the headline of this book, why it was so mired in controversy for so long, of how much of this there was across the league, how common all of this was. And it does feel weird that this one guy, who certainly is not a star, is, getting hammered for these transgressions that don't feel particularly extreme. But at the same time, yeah, I think just you can get away with a lot more by being really good or being a really good hang. And it seems like maybe he wasn't much of either. So
George Brunet, not a chill hang. George Brunet was many things. Apparently not good to hang out with was one of them. I have a real quick little thing with Ball before I ask us like a fun, silly question about. Well, I guess this one's also fun. Like a lot of this is fun and silly.
Yeah.
George Brunet apparently pitched commando all the time. No underpants. I assume no jockstrap. So he's not expecting a comebacker up the middle, I guess. What? Like, is that for someone who has been around baseball? Like, is there do people do that? Like, is that a thing, or is he really weird in that way?
I will say, not an expert personally on the specific point. That does seem insane to me, and I have seen nothing to suggest anyone currently would do that. But yeah, it really does play into the mythology of like this guy is just his own character in so many ways. Because
he's doing his own thing. So, last thing about Ball 4. As I played a little clip in the original podcast, Ball 4 had a sitcom on CBS.
That was the first thing I wanted to ask you about. I had not heard of this, and that detail like immediately leaped out to me of just like, what, how? So yes, please talk more about this.
Yeah, so I was able to find, I think, one full episode on YouTube, which I did watch for you, the listeners. It was actually really fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, Jim Bouton played himself, which is an insane... It would be like if Ted Danson on Cheers was actually played by a former Boston Red Sox. Like, because Ted Danson's character on Cheers is like canonically a former Red Sox player who now owns the Cheers bar. But, like, imagine if you had just gotten somebody, like Yastrzemski or somebody, like, hey, just get in there. You'll be fine. It'll be great. I'm sure you can act. But, and this is true, and this is, it's great for Pride Month. There is a storyline in the series where there is a gay character.
In the 70s? On
Yes.
CBS?
Yes!
Wow.
There is a gay character. So, hey, they don't deal with it particularly well because, again, the 70s, and they were literally in locker rooms. So, like, they were kind of taking the worst angle at it you could possibly take. But they don't... It could have been so much worse, and the fact that they actually have a character, and I believe Jim Bouton's character goes out of his way to, like, help and defend this character, is really fascinating and something I was not expecting from a 6-episode baseball sitcom on CBS in the 70s. So I would not suggest going and watching it because it's not good, but we can appreciate it for what it did.
Well, that actually very much made me want to watch it because now I want to see both how all of that was handled, but also just Jim Bouton as an actor. I have a lot of questions, and I don't think I can satisfy any of them without watching it. Because, wow, just the idea of that existing is fascinating on so many levels. And wow, yeah, I'm really glad someone has put at least one episode on YouTube.
So that brings me to the question that I was going to ask about that, which is like, I think... you could make today a sitcom about George Brunet's life. This man who was constantly being shuffled up and down majors and minors, and then he moves to Mexico and he kind of washes out, but is like super good there. I think that's a made-for-TV story. I don't understand why we haven't done that. Ball 4 sitcom, not so much. But El Viejo sitcom, yes.
Okay, I agree, and I can see two versions of this working. One is in more of like a sanitized Ted Lasso version, where it's like, oh, he's this fish out of water going to a different country where he's like trying to wrestle with like his personal life is maybe in shambles, and he's trying to figure out who he can be in this new environment. And surprise, it works out really well, and he ends up like winning and being able to make it here. Or I think you can make a version that is maybe truer to life and still really funny, just in a darker, more adult way. But yes, this is a great idea. I think this could work on several levels.
Okay, I'll pitch. I'll get a spec script going, and we can pitch this. I'm sure I want to see it. I think it'd be great. I love the idea of the Ted Lasso part of it, especially because essentially it's the exact plot of Ted Lasso, where he literally goes to a different country as he's going through a divorce and has like really weird and surprising success. The next thing is, I guess, listeners in the comments, cast this sitcom. Who's George Brunet? Who are some of the players? Who are some of the managers? I think, and it would also be great because there'd be a lot of great roles for Hispanic actors that I think would be really, you could get some real fun things going in there. As long as they're not, going and playing soccer like the guy who was Danny Rojas in Ted Lasso, who's now a professional soccer player. So we're getting into Mexico. Let's get into Mexico. Did you know anything about Mexican baseball before listening to the pod? Because I will straight up say that I only knew what came over from like Pablo Sandoval playing there a few years ago.
Yeah, no, the fact that the Mexican League exists and has existed for a long time was about the extent of my knowledge. And that's why I really appreciated the interview with Padilla. I found it striking, the point where he was listing how many great players would come over and play in the winter when that was the format. Like, I thought that really grounded what Brunet was able to do pretty well. Yeah,
and I mean, I knew but didn't, think about the fact that there are two leagues, right? There's the Winter League and the Summer League, LMB and LMP. And yeah, the off-season league, the Winter League, basically would just, if back before players were making enough money on their major league contracts so that they never, obviously didn't have to work a day in their lives outside of, the baseball season. They would go over to supplement their income and to stay sharp. They would just go and play in the Mexican League. And so there's a lot of really kind of great stories about that. And of course, that brings us to kind of like, there are some famous names in Mexico like right now, like Justin Turner's playing over there. I think at 41, he's age 41. Luis Cessa, Billy Hamilton's playing over there. Robinson Cano, I already mentioned Pablo Sandoval. But none of them are playing till they're 50. Do you think it's just a lack of motivation?
Maybe so. Maybe the key is the motivation, the lack of underwear, maybe a little more booze, and apparently that's the recipe.
Yeah, and he was also, I learned also going through this that George Brunet was big into steaks. Steak guy.
That fits, yeah.
He also, big fisherman. So one thing I didn't get to work into the pod as deeply as I wanted to is like, or rather, a through line that I had, but, I'm going to emphasize here, is that dude was big into fishing. He learned about baseball coming back from a fishing trip, but in Mexico, he bought a charter boat and had a fishing like service where he would take people out and do deep sea fishing. And so he was, if he loved one thing, it was obviously baseball. If he loved two things, baseball, fishing. So he's an angler.
It's a very classic baseball player hobby, I think, as a secondary passion. Yeah, that really fits.
And Francisco Padilla talked about the fact that he played at sea level, basically at all of his teams. Why? So he could go fishing. The man loved to fish. So we don't really have this problem with baseball having been recorded, in the United States forever. Like, you can get reels of Babe Ruth playing, and all the way back, and even further than that. Like, baseball was one of the first things we photographed. But in Mexico, as said in the podcast, there's just no video up until pretty recently. Certainly not in the 70s, 80s, 90s times. Do you think the lack of this video will kind of create the problem that the lack of the Wilt Chamberlain scoring 100 video is, where people like won't believe these people existed? They're like, well, I can't see it, so it must not have happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of even brushed up against it with the fact that the end date of his career is kind of shrouded and obscured in mystery. That even though you have the Mexican Hall of Fame, clear supporting evidence that, it ended when it ended, and at the end was kind of like not true professional baseball, the figure that gets cited the most. the fact that you already have that kind of taking on a life of its own as a myth, I guess, in some ways, I feel like that already points to that, right? Of you have, when you don't have that like very clear, organized, concrete record keeping and photography and videography that we're used to being able to look at as here's exactly what happened, here was what this game was, who was in it, here's the last game he played. When you don't have that, it kind of just lets that mystery spiral and in ways that I think can be good for the aura of a story, if not good for the actual historical specificity of the truth. And yeah, I think any place that you have like kind of enough air getting into a story to create doubt, I think you have a little of that effect happening. And it kind of makes sense to me that you would see that happening here.
Yeah, and something that they provided me with, but obviously I can't, have on the podcast because it's an audio medium. They had the scorecards for both of his no-hitters. I was sent both of those as scorecards because I asked for audio, of course. I was like, hey, can you, I'd love to have a call of the game. And as said in the podcast, that doesn't exist. But they did have the scorecards, and I think that people are just going to have to take those things as what they as what happened. They also sent me a ton of photos, which is great because it is so hard to find kind of any evidence that George Brunet existed outside of his baseball cards. And there's like there's a couple of like articles that are good. Like one of them, the Hardball Times had a great one that was written from the perspective of his arm. So it's of his left arm is writing the article. He's getting interviewed. It's very fun. It's one of the things I looked at. So if you go look at the show notes, that'll be there. But yeah, I mean, I think that we gotta have media literacy to the point where people understand and believe things happened, even if they don't have video, especially because soon you'll be able to fake video and it won't be good. It won't be good for any of us. Okay. So George Brunet accomplished a lot of things in his career. A lot of things. What, for you, is the most impressive part of his career?
Ooh. Part of me wants to say coming back from that inning from hell, that just the simple act of not having just a career after being tagged with something as bad as that, but a very long career that survived through so many ups and downs is so impressive on its own. But I think just even more impressive than that, I guess, the fact that there is such a robust second act here, right? That like at 38, it's very easy to say, this was a good run, that was a good, solid career playing baseball, making a living doing that. Very cool. Natural age to hang it up. And I think the idea of being driven enough to say like, no, there has to be something else, but then actually making that something else work as long as he did. I think, in some ways, I think that there's a underlying current of tragedy in there, as we've talked about, of not being able to say no and pack it in and find a life outside of that. But there's also something really admirable about insisting that it has to work and then actually making it work. Like I really just have always loved a story like that.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of what I wanted to leave people with after the podcast was like, this career is worth celebrating. Like, yeah. It might not be a Hall of Fame, U.S. baseball career where he has a plaque in Cooperstown, but it is a career that like is notable and is fascinating and is important and probably is in a lot of ways more interesting, certainly, than your, a Hall of Very Good pitcher, in Major League Baseball. I personally, my favorite accomplishment of his is the no-nos thrown 20 years apart.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, and then he was like, okay, that was too long to wait. I'm gonna throw another one in like 5 months. And he did it in both leagues, and that's just amazing. And he was, obviously he was in like his 40s. I think he was 40 and 41 when he did it. And just I can't imagine that record being broken.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's like an invincible record.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So I think there's just a couple questions I have left. And one of them is, how should we remember George Brunet? Because I started the podcast saying like most people don't even know about him. Well, now we do. We know about him. But where do we put him in our minds when we think about baseball and what we think about pitching and what we think about people?
I think, if anything, he's a really good reminder of how rich and varied and expansive baseball culture is outside MLB. That you have, we've already had some of these big picture discussions about the nature of the record book with some of the changes over the last couple of years with admitting the Negro League stats to the MLB record books and what that means. That, like, this game has always been so much bigger than just what we see as MLB. It's been bigger inside the US and, of course, obviously in so many ways bigger outside the US. And I think it's just he serves as a really cool reminder that, a career in the context of MLB can be something completely different outside of it. And, I think there's certainly a lot of other really cool, fun, admirable bits of this history apart from that. Just the longevity alone, the ability to reinvent yourself, etc., I think are all cool, like very classic baseball character bits of lore, which I really enjoy. But I think that is kind of what stands out to me of the idea that, we had one idea of what this career looked like inside the confines of MLB, and it was something completely else outside of it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it also just reminds you just how big world baseball is. Like, he didn't even go to Japan. I know that makes it's a kind of flippant thing. Like, he didn't even go to Japan. He went everywhere. He played for like national teams for like Puerto Rico and stuff. He played all over the United States too. But we just don't consider these other leagues. And I think stories like Brunet's kind of almost go in a similar place, weirdly, to stories like Shohei Ohtani's, who's like somebody who is in a different league and was absolutely killing it. But if he didn't come over to Major League Baseball, I don't think he would have occupied the same space that he's occupying now as kind of like this, I would say he's the most famous baseball player in the world right now, probably.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So,
a long shot.
Yeah, I think that it's a great reminder that like baseball lives outside of Major League Baseball. Like, Major League Baseball is wonderful, but there's so much going on, not just like in other like levels of the leagues, like minor leagues and stuff, but also everywhere else in the world. And so if you want to, you can probably flip on the television at any time and watch a baseball game from somewhere. So the last question. We already said that he got to Monterrey, Mexican Baseball Hall of Fame. He has a plaque there. He's not in Cooperstown. And I don't think he deserves a plaque there. But I do think there should be something of George Brunet's in Cooperstown. He played the longest pro baseball career of all time. What kind of display, what kind of exhibit should George Brunet have in the Baseball Hall of Fame?
I love this question, and this is one of the things that always strikes me about going to Cooperstown, which, I've only done a handful of times as an adult, but every time I go back, I'm reminded of how big the museum is and how expansive and how much there is in Cooperstown besides just the Hall of Fame and the plaques itself, that this museum is such a huge structure. And I think there's a case for an exhibit on like baseball's rich history of weird characters and oddities and guys who have built careers that maybe don't make sense and have done it while being so completely themselves. And he feels like a perfect kind of guy for that. That, maybe you're going to lead it with someone more like a Rube Waddell, who I would say, pioneered the form of being a weird baseball character. But I think George Brunet fits in that history. I think he should earn a spot in that exhibit.
Absolutely. What I want, at least in part of the exhibit, is all the hats of every team he played for, just going down, because it's, what I say, 34 teams, I think, or 34 plus, because I didn't count international teams. Like playing for a country, like I counted all the ones from Mexico. But he played for 34 plus squads, and so I just want to see all the hats lined up. And I think that would be a perfect display of, like, this dude played everywhere.
I love that. Yes, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma. Do you want to plug anything before we go? Do you have, obviously you're writing for Sports Illustrated. Where can people find you? Where can people interact with your work?
Yeah, I'm on social media generally at Emma Baccellieri, work at si.com. I have a relatively new book about women's basketball out called Court Queens, and that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast, and till the next time, let's play to the echo of the whistle.